Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by KosherCloth.com. One thing I appreciate about KosherCloth.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a megillah, or even a sefer Torah, they take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit KosherCloth.com. That's KosherKlaf.com, or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link and information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status. Also, check out the newly redesigned Svarim Chatter website. And check out especially the feature bookstore, where you can find the books and Svarim discussed on the podcast. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Mordechai Cohen, who is the author, mechaber of the brand new sefer titled Chilazon, HaTecheiles, a critical investigation of the source of HaTecheiles, its disappearance, and the modern Murex theory, published by Mechon Al-Zayis. So thank you, Mati, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Interestingly, when this book came out, and there are HaTecheiles books that come out from time, to say the least, and a few years ago, somebody mentioned that I should do an episode on HaTecheiles. I did not get around to it. Tafyomi did it recently. Still didn't get a chance to do it. But then this book came out, and I was recording an episode with Rabbi Shimon Shimanowitz, and he took a call right before, and he had you on the phone. And he said, "Nachi, you have to interview me. You should do this podcast." So, okay, you reached out to me. I said, maybe let me send me a copy of the book. Let me get a chance to read it. And I read it, and I have to say, it's a very enjoyable, very interesting read. Over 400 pages. I think we should say at the outset it's kind of anti the current modern HaTecheiles. So perhaps in the future I'll have to do a pro HaTecheiles. We got to do the two sides of the coin over here. But just to mention that right off the bat. Okay, Mati, let's start. I want to tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so I grew up in Oak Park, Michigan. Went to Yeshiva Gedola through 11th grade. I skipped 12th grade and went straight to a gap year program in Eretz Yisrael called Migdal Torah, which is the non-Orthodox gap year program. I was there with my brother for 1 year. He was the Av Bias the first year I got there, and then I stayed another 3 years. So I ended up being there for 4 years. And then went to yeshiva called Yeshiva B'nai Torah in Far Rockaway for about 6 months, where I met my wife, got married, and moved back to Michigan, and I joined a Kollel. First, I was in a Chassidish Kollel at Dav Ben Nachum, and was there for a couple of years, and then I switched over to Chaysh Mishpah Kollel. Rabbi Yisrael Sibiak is the Rosh Kollel there. There with my brother. I've been there for a few years now, and I teach 5th grade English at the Yeshiva Star Torah, which is one of the schools there.
How did you become interested in HaTecheiles? I think you see a lot of these HaTecheiles books or pamphlets, and there's a lot of that today and a lot of literature on it today. I think a lot of it, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, is by those that are interested, and especially which have an agenda to promote HaTecheiles, Murex HaTecheiles, as the proper HaTecheiles, and that people should be wearing HaTecheiles. You, as we'll discuss, it's kind of not that way, but where did the interest come from in general, and then specifically to research it as deeply as you did and write a book on this?
Yes, that's a great question. So I mentioned the yeshiva I went to in Eretz Yisrael was the modern Orthodox yeshiva. It was like a very, very, I think the term they use is a rationalist, like Maimonidean kind of yeshiva, which basically means that their approach to lots of areas in Torah is very, very, let's call it philosophically based. They try to make sure everything is fits in with science and rationality, but a lot of times the rationality is how it's understood by in a way that could be explained to somebody who doesn't have Yiddishkeit. So a lot of the conclusions that come out would be, for example, whether they believe in Shadim, or whether they believe in Kishav, or whether they believe the world is under 6,000 years old when it was created. Then it's really 14 million or billion years old. So all those kind of things were not held of in the yeshiva that I went to, and obviously coming from Yeshiva Gedola, this was a bit of a culture shock for me. And I remember because I, going there, so they they would have a lot of arguments that were kind of more secular based, which was new for me. But then they also seemed to have a lot of Makairos from Rishonim, from Gemaras, which seemed to back up their position, which was a position that I'd never heard at all before this. So it was a little bit scary for me almost. I remember one time I was discussing with my Rosh Yeshiva about whether Chazal knew science or not, and he sent me like a blog post from Natan Slifkin, which had like I think like 80 Makairos of like Rishonim, Achreinim, Gemaras, saying that Chazal didn't know science, and I was like shocked when I saw it. I think I even like started crying when I was reading it, just because I didn't even know what to do, because it was like so against everything I'd been taught. So I called up my brother, my older brother who's in Cohen with me, and he said, slow down. Let's look at each makar. We'll go through it. So we started going through it, and we went through each, and I realized that every single one of them was either misrepresented, misquoted, half quoted, or was correctly quoted, but the conclusion drawn from it was incorrect. And so following that experience, the being there for 4 years, so it allowed me to go through a lot of different sugyas without kind of taking anything for granted, but going through everything from the bottom up, and also gave me the ability to kind of go through secular studies also. And something I learned, which was very important for me, is that when the Torah says something, so when science seems to contradict it, so oftentimes the approach is, okay, so we're going to ignore the science because Torah says something. And the other approach is to try to synthesize the two. I found that when you have a proper understanding of what the Torah is saying, so the science basically is not going to be contradicting that if you have a true understanding of the science also. So following my 4 years in yeshiva there, I started a podcast with my brother called Jewish Thought Flow, where we went through a bunch of different sugyas and just went through the scientific aspect of it, and also the Torah aspect of it, and just to show how the Torah approach is not just the Torah approach, it's also the most rational approach. So I went through like age of the universe, different miracles, whether the Nife's flood was a worldwide flood, different things that academia has as pasha not correct, and we're just showing how it's the most rational, not just from Torah, but also from the academic standpoint. So obviously, HaTecheiles was something that got brought up a bunch of times by people that we should do it. We should do an episode on it. And when we actually got started, so we kind of had it as it seems pashut that the Murex is the Chilazon. That seemed to be what the consensus was. It seemed all the rise were going that way. This is before we had started the research, and we kind of just wanted to explore why exactly the Rav of the yeshivish community don't wear HaTecheiles if it's correct. So what exactly is the argument to not wear? So that's where we started. That's where we started the research for the podcast, and we spent a few months researching it. And as we were going through it, we started to realize that a lot of the rayas were not rayas. Then we started realizing that there are actually rayas against it, and slowly started building up the case against it. And after we released that podcast, we got a lot of responses, and most of our, it wasn't a big podcast, so we had a few hundred listeners, but maybe a couple of people would email us with questions or comments. But after the HaTecheiles one, we got a lot of emails, and kind of angry emails, and telling us we missed things and mistakes we made and all that. So it forced more and more research, and then I started writing like little essays on different like mini topics, and the arguments were just going on and on and on. And my brother said, like, instead of having these little arguments and writing these essays, why don't you start? You've already compiled most of the material. Why don't you just start putting a sefer together? So that was about probably 4 years ago that started, and over the 4 years, it grew and grew and grew, and Baruch Hashem finally came up.
Yeah, 400-page plus book. Yeah, I'm curious. We'll see the reactions here. So anyone, let's get to it, and then we'll talk about the reactions that you've gotten so far since the book's been published, which is fairly recently. So, as you call it in the beginning of the book, the quest for the Chilazon, a brief history. Let's start there and just give the overview, if you will, because there's really like a snapshot, an overview of the book and of the state of things and the history. And the book, I should mention right away, the book is very interesting. I think we should mention the structure of the book, where the book kind of goes through like the sugya, and then just in general going through the sugya, and then going through the Murex theory, as well as the book. The second part of the book is academia, where you really go through a lot of the Murex theory, and then historical, archaeological, linguistical, all that kind of academic side of things. And the first part is really I should actually go backwards to the Chilazon and Chazal, Simonim, and so on. So let's start at the beginning. Like I said, the quest for the Chilazon and a brief history.
Yeah. So this is very interesting, and the way I'm going to say it over now is it's going to be slightly different just because I'm going to be more focused than it is in the Sefer. But the Radziner Rabbi basically had a hargish that it was time for Tchelis to be found, and he felt like we should be striving to search for it. So he put out a Sefer, a very small Sefer. Yes, sorry.
And I want to mention that we're talking 1879. Okay, so we're talking late 19th century is the first time that really they found that this is the time to rediscover Tchelis.
Yeah. And he put out a Sefer called Sfunut Munechal, where the first part of the Sefer, he goes through the claims that we can't find the Chilazon, that it's nignaz, and he attempts to address the claims that it's nignaz, that we need a Messiah to find it. That's because in his time, obviously it had been nignaz for well over 1,000 years at that point. So the first kind of chiddush of his approach was that it's possible to find it. We're going to see that this was not exactly agreed upon. And the last part of the Sefer is obviously, okay, so if we're going to find the Chilazon, if we're going to find Tchelis, which has to come from a Chilazon, so we need to know what the Chilazon is that we're looking for. And he laid out from Chazal, he went through all the Gemaras, the Rishonim, and laid out descriptions of what exactly the Chilazon should look like, so that we can go ahead and find a creature that matches the Siman. He goes, after he puts up the Sefer, he goes to an aquarium and finds a creature, a cuttlefish, that he holds, that he explains how it matches all of the Simanim that he gave from Chazal as to what the Chilazon should look like. And he said, therefore, this could be the Chilazon. And he used there's a dye sac in the cuttlefish, like an inky black sac, that if you take that ink and you mix, he figured out a way that if you mix it with certain ingredients, so it can turn it blue. And he said this is Kasher Tchelis, and his subsequent Sefer Svarim went ahead to try to defend both the particular creature and also the claims that we can't find the Chilazon in general. So that was the Radziner's contribution to the Chilazon sugya. And the Gedalim of his time, there are a couple of exceptions, but Al Pi Raiv, the Skamas Kol Gedolei Yisrael was that we don't wear the Radzin Tchelis, which is why following the 1880s we find that the Gedalim are not wearing Tchelis and we are not wearing Radzin Tchelis today. So obviously they disagreed. Now the number one reason that's most commonly cited as to why there was a disagreement was because there was an assumption that the Chilazon is nignaz, and unless you could find something that's vadai 100% correct, so we're not gonna go against the assumption that it was gamas. We're not going to say, well, this creature matches the percent. If you read this source like this, so then it can also match. That's not good enough. It has to in order to override the geniza, we need 100% certainty that this is correct. So that was the first attempt to find it. Now, a lot of people are under a misconception that the next person to go look into it was Rav Herzog, and Rav Herzog searched and found this snail, the Murex tranquillus, which is the creature that they make tchelis from nowadays. I'll be right with the people who were tchelis that were in from the snail. And people think that Rav Herzog went ahead and looked and found this thing, and then they went through why it could be correct. The reality is that in the 17th century, in the 1600s already, the Christian academics, biblical scholars were trying to figure out what was this biblical blue, the tchelis from the Torah and our gaman. And they looked through the history books and they realized that in terms of creatures that produce a dye in this kind of range, there's this family of snails, basically 3 snails that produce this purple dye. And so some of the dye was more bluish purple, and some of the dyes produced from these snails was more reddish purple. So the Christian academics said, okay, so it must be tchelis and argaman come from these snails, and the tchelis is the blue purple, and the argaman is the reddish purple that comes from these snails. Okay. Then as the years went on, they started to get more exact knowledge as to which the snails were used to make which ones. In the early 1800s, they thought maybe the Janthino, which is actually a fourth of these snails, was the one that made the blue-purple. And eventually in the 1850s, it was confirmed that the Tranquillus is the one that made the blue-purple. Okay, so just in terms of how the Christians came about it, obviously they weren't coming from any of the Simanim of Chazal. They weren't coming from Chazal at all. They were coming from the Bible, the Torah describing Tchelas and Argaman. And based on the knowledge of history, there's only a couple of candidates that can make something that could even possibly be these colors, which are these snails. So it must have been these snails, and therefore Tchelas, not only is Tchelas come from the Tranquillus, but Tchelas must have been a blue-purple color also. So it's really at that stage in history. Now, sorry, that's the 1850s. That's right before the Redziner. So when the Redziner Rebbe is going to find the Chilazon, he's doing a lot of research, besides for within Chazal, obviously, but clearly he went to an aquarium. He's doing a lot of research outside. It's very obvious that he was aware of the academic conclusion that the Tranquillus was the Chilazon. And it's obvious if you read Sfuna to Menecholis for a Sefer why he never even looked into it, is because it doesn't match any of the Simanim of Chazal as he understood from Chazal. Now, Rav Herzog comes in the early 1900s, in 1917, and he writes a PhD thesis about this very topic of Argaman and Tchelas. And he comes, because he's writing a PhD thesis, so his whole point is that obviously if you have a Messiah, so it's not going to be, you're going to realize that the Tranquillus doesn't match the Simanim. But he says even from a purely academic standpoint, it can't be correct either, because the Gemara, which in our eyes is the Messiah, but even from an academic perspective, a Bryce in the Gemara is at least a testimony, a first-hand testimony as to what the Chilazon should look like. And there's a Bryce in Menachos which describe what the Chilazon looks like. And Rav Herzog said that the descriptions in this Bryce don't match the Mirach Tranquillus at all. So not only was Rav Herzog not coming to identify the Tranquillus as a Chilazon, he was actually coming to argue with the academics who said the Tranquillus was a Chilazon, and he was coming to say no, because it doesn't match your Bryce. So that's where where things left again. That was again in the early 1900s. Now the way you're going to hear, I've seen this numerous times. I've seen this written down in Svarim and said over in Shirim. They'll say Rav Herzog said that the Chilazon is the Mirach Tranquillus. The only reason it can't be is because we see it makes a blue-purple dye and not a blue dye. And then they say, oh, okay, so that's how they present Rav Herzog. And therefore they say, if we could figure out a way to make a blue dye out of it, so even Rav Herzog would be masking that this is the Chilazon of Tchelas. After that, about 70 years later, there was a few American businessmen and Israeli scientists who were also interested in the sugya. And basically they figure out a way to manipulate the dye from the Mirach Tranquillus to turn it from a blue-purple dye. They figured out a way to kill off all the purple elements to the dye and make a pure blue. And they said, now we found Tchelas. And basically, pretty soon after that, there was one Rav who was involved, Rabbi Tavgar. And after that, it starts trying to make a kind of more of a yeshivish push in terms of describing the Chilazon. So again, the problem with the Mirachs being the Chilazon is going to be that it doesn't seem to match the descriptions. After the 1980s, there started to be a push to figure out if there's a way to actually make it match with the descriptions from Chazal as to what the Chilazon is, see if we can match this creature that the Christians have had as the Chilazon for 300 years, 350 years. Is there a way we can match this up with Chazal? Even though the Redziner didn't hold a match and Rav Herzog didn't hold a match, maybe we could figure out a way it does match. So that's kind of where the sugya starts from a historical perspective.
A couple things to add on, and you like you said, you recount this in brief in the book and just now, and it's a very interesting story. So Rav Herzog, first of all, says that the Redziner was duped by the chemist with the cuttlefish, and he. That's one thing. Also, as you mentioned, Rav Herzog, it was his thesis. He was then chief rabbi in Dublin, Ireland. He ended up later on, Rav Isaac Herzog becomes the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael. This was his thesis, which is later published, and it was just actually recently republished. There's 2 volumes of the writings of Rav Herzog, was published by the Library of the Jewish People, which was published through Cohen publishers, and it's in there. It's the first book in these collected writings. You can read it in there. And, as you say, and as we'll discuss, I'm sure, is that Rav Herzog's kind of tightness and his issues with the Murex being the Tchelas. So that's kind of, and I think the one part that you end off with is the move to the yeshiva world. You want to mention that now already before we get a little bit more into the sugya?
I mean, just from a historical perspective, it seems like it clearly has moved more into the yeshiva world. It's become much more of a tzad in the yeshiva world. And this is due to the presentation, where the presentation is much more originally. Again, if you read the let's call them the papers from the 1980s, when the first people who were presenting this, it's not at all anything that would be at all palatable to anybody who's a Ben Torah. The move to the yeshivish world was basically taking this creature and presenting it in a much more acceptable manner that a yeshiva bacher can hear and say, like, yeah, Taka, this sounds good.
Okay, so let's turn to the Chilazon, but I think we really should start with, again, as I mentioned before, this book is definitely an anti-book, and definitely you're taking the approach that the Merix is not the case. And your overall point, if I can say, in the thesis of the book seems to be that they are coming from the perspective that they found a creature, the Murex, and they said, okay, this can work. Let's now shoehorn this into every possible source of the Torah and Chazal and make it work, rather than saying, let's work through the sugya, see what the Torah says and the Chazal says should be the criteria for the Tcheles, and now let's go search for that creature. And that seems to be, at least that's how, when I read the book, it seems to be that is the overarching thesis. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So that's mostly based on if you read the original writings, even from the Rabbanim and the earlier Svarim, they cannot speak this out beferish. But as you go through the sugya, you'll be able. Well, it's much more clear when you go through the actual sugya than just believing me saying it. But the essential proof is that from a historical academic perspective, it's come out 100%. So now the question is it shaylo from the sugya, or can even the sugya allow for it? But either you can trust me, or we can go through the different points in the sugya, and I can show you how at each point it's brought out.
Yeah, we definitely want to go through some of the sugya. Of course, in depth. I mean, the book is 400 plus pages. Everyone should read the book. I'm sure there are those that will take the other side. And like I said, in the future, perhaps, someone mentioned me, he's like, oh, you should do like a show, given to, you should have like a debate, which is not something we generally do, but perhaps, we can have a rebuttal. We can see how this goes. So let's start like this. What is the Chilazon? This is something you discussed. The word Chilazon and then Chilazon HaTecheiles. In general, I mentioned the name of the book, and people are thinking, what do you mean Chilazon HaTecheiles? What does that even mean? So I think this is an opportunity because there's what Chilazon is and what Chilazon HaTecheiles is to start.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is something again that when I started this sugya I had no idea, but it's very important to know. The word Chilazon shows up throughout Gemara's Midrashim and Rishonim, and not every time it shows up is it talking about the Chilazon Tcheles. We think the Chilazon is like the name of the creature that produced Tcheles. The word Chilazon is a word that refers to certain types of creatures. It's not a Hebrew word. So just throughout Chazal, you see it being used as to refer to different things. So, for example, one of the things that it gets referred to is it refers to a locust. The Medrash says that the bard came down, it would come down like the locust. The Beersheva even says that there's a Medrash that says that as long as it was growing, its nartik would grow. And the Beersheva says this is talking about a locust that has a certain nartik that grows with it. In the Rishonim, you see very clearly that Chilazon doesn't always refer to the Chilazon Tcheles. It can refer to clams, it can refer to oysters, it can refer to slugs, worms, it can refer to snails. It's the name of a mum. It's the name of a river. The word Chilazon, when it appears in Shas and Midrashim, is not always talking about the Chilazon Tcheles. And it's very, very important to know this because when the Rishonim are talking about the Chilazon Tcheles and they make it clear they're talking about the Chilazon Tcheles, and they say a certain thing, and then when they're not talking about the Chilazon Tcheles and they say something else, so we don't have to mix the two of them up. We can deal with one on its own and the other as a separate topic. So one of the first chapters in the Sefer is just going through all the different uses of the word Chilazon throughout the Gemara and Midrashim and Rishonim, just to show that it doesn't always refer to Chilazon Tcheles. The following chapter I bring down from different Rishonim. For example, there's Gemara in Sanhedrin, which references a certain Chilazon that one of the Amoraim used as a mashal for Tchias Mesim, Chilazon on the mountain. So Rashi says that this Chilazon is the Tailas that they died Tcheles from it, and when it goes up on the mountain, that's just talking about. Sorry, it's talking about the Chilazon Tcheles. It's the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Yad Rama argues and says he has a lot of questions on whether it's talking about the Chilazon Tchelas. He says, no, this is not the Telea, it's not the Telas that's the Chilazon Tchelas. This Chilazon in the Gemara and Sanhedrin is talking about a different Chilazon. It's a type of Chilazon that gets created from water and dirt mixed together, and it's called a Chilzun, which is Pasha's talking about a snail over there. And again, there's through the book, I bring numerous examples of how the Rishonim differentiate between the Chilazon and the Chilazon Tchelas. And the reason I set that out right at the beginning is because, again, when we discuss what the Chilazon Tchelas is, all the Rishonim are very, very clear what the Chilazon Tchelas was, and the way it gets presented in order to justify the Murex, which hopefully we'll see in a second, is specifically by focusing on examples where Chilazon is not talking about the Chilazon Tchelas and using that to define the Chilazon Tchelas and ignoring the times when we're actually talking about the Chilazon Tchelas. Okay, so if we're talking about the species of the Chilazon Tchelas, so Rashi says that the Chilazon Tchelas is a telas. In one place he calls it a telas, which is a worm. We know that the Chilazon Tchelas is a sea creature. Rashi also calls it kamin dag katan, that it's like a small fish. Now, Be'ikr in the Gemara we have, or in the Gemara and Teres Kainim, in Teres Kainim that brings down a drasha from the pasuk. It says it calls it a telas shani. Telas shani is one of the dyes that they would use in the Mishkan. So it says Yachol Achon Meshamayim Atzibainim. I would think that it's a different one of the colors, and the Mefarshim explain over there. The Rishonim explain, the Rosh Mishans and others, that I might think that it's a different telas that you make tchelas from. That you make a color from. For example, the Chilazon Tchelas, which was a telas. So you have Teres Kainim saying that it's the telas shani is a certain type of telas. Lafuke, the Chilazon, which was a different type of telas. And then the main makar seems to be the Brisa in Menachos, which describes the Chilazon, which says Briyasai daimel dog, that its formation is daimel dog, which Rashi says Tavnis diuknai, its appearance is like a dog. Rabbi Gershom says its surah is like a dog. So if let's present it like this: if the Gemara over there is telling us that it's daimel dog, that it's Briyasai is daimel dog, so we see basically two things from that it's not technically a dog, it's not technically a fish, but its form is like a fish. So that would explain Rashi. Rashi says it's a telas, and he says it's kamin dag katan. It's like a small fish. So if we're going to imagine something that's a telas, it's like a small fish, or a telas, it's in the form of a fish. So if you think of a sea worm, some sort of worm, which lives in a sea and has fins, it swims around like a fish. So it's not technically a fish, but it's kamin dag katan, and it's briyasa dem ladug, and that would be good. That would match Rashi. It's not just Rashi; it's about 6 or 7 other Rishonim will also call it telas. So that's one stream of Rishonim, which I think fits very well with the Gemara, that briyasa dem ladug, but it's not exactly a dog. So it's a telas. It's like a dog. That's one stream of Rishonim. The other stream of Rishonim is led by the Rambam, who calls it a dog. So the kasha is, how could it be a dog? The Brisa says it's briyasa is daimel dog. So the Rambam, when he's describing what kind of sea creatures there are, so this comes up in Machalas Asuras, because we need to know what's considered a dog, what's considered a chayas hayam, what's considered a sheretz hayam. So the Rambam there lays down the klal that anything that's in the tsura of a dog is called a dog, and anything that's not in the tsura of a dog, that's not in the form of a fish, says, for example, he gives an example like leeches or worms of the sea or frogs, things like that. Things that are in the sea but are not in the form of a fish are called a sheretz. So the Rambam lays down very clear that a creature in the sea that's not in the form of a fish would be called a sheretz, and a creature, or a chaya, and a creature in the sea that is in the form of fish is called a dog. So again, working. Let's just, if we put this all together. So the Rambam calls the Chilazon Tchelas a dog, and we know that in order to be called a dog, it needs to be in the tzura of a dog, which happens to be what the Brisa describes as briyasa is daimel dog. So there you have the Rambam also calling it a dog, which means that it has to be in the tzura of a dog. Now, again, the dog, kamin dag katan, telas, these are all words that cannot refer to a snail. There's no time that the word telas refers to a snail. A dog cannot refer to a snail because a sea snail, is a sheretz hayam. It's not a dog, shebayam. It's a sheretz hayam. Now again, it's not just the Rambam. There's a list I have in the sefer I bring down. There's a list of about 15 Rishonim who call it a dog. Now it's not like sometimes they call it dog, sometimes they call it something else, or sometimes they call it telas, sometimes they call it else. They're either calling it telas, kamin dog, or dog. Those are the only lashonos given for the Chilazon Tchelas by the Rishonim, without exception. So when you have 25 Rishonim explaining that the Chilazon HaTecheiles is daimel a dog, is a dog, is in the tzur of a dog. So we know what that means. That means we definitely know what it's not. We know it's not something that's not in the tzur of a dog, and the Mirach Shrankulis is not in the tzur of a dog. It's a sheretz. Yeah, so that's what the Rishonim say. Go ahead.
I'm sure many are thinking, what about the nartik you mentioned before, the shell?
Yeah, okay. So the Rishonim don't bring down this medrash legabe the Chilazon HaTecheiles. So as we mentioned before, there's different. There's different. The word Chilazon doesn't always refer to the Chilazon HaTecheiles. The Rishonim don't talk about this medrash in regards to the Chilazon HaTecheiles. The Aruch actually specifically puts it into a separate category. There are some Achronim, very early Achronim, who do seem to learn that it is talking about the Chilazon HaTecheiles. So just a quick word on a nartik. So a nartik does not mean a shell. That's just it's a misrepresentation. A nartik doesn't mean a shell. A nartik generally just means some sort of covering. So a nartik could be, it can refer to a sheath of a sword, right? Because it covers the sword. It can refer to a bag. It can refer to something that covers vessels. We just saw on Tisha B'Av in Eicha. So Rashi says that the nachash, the female nachash has a nartik that when it gets removed when she wants to nurse the baby snakes, it removes the nartik. I mentioned earlier the Be'er Sheva, who mentions that this medrash of an nartik is actually referring to a locust. So there's basically two ways you can explain this. Either the medrash is not talking about the Chilazon HaTecheiles, which seems to be how Rashi learns, because Rashi changes the lashon from Chilazon to Chaimet. The Rosh also changes the gersa. But even if you want to say this medrash does refer to the Chilazon HaTecheiles, so you'll have to say that the Chilazon HaTecheiles somehow has something that's a nartik, has some sort of covering that grows with it. But what you can't say is that covering is a shell, because if it was a shell, unless you could say somehow that it's I guess you could technically say that it's some sort of sea creature that's in the tzura of a dog, but also has a shell, which I don't know of any. But it wouldn't be a regular snail, because that wouldn't match with the other Rishonim. So if you want to say that these Rishonim, all the Rishonim who describe it as a telas, kaminda, a dog, also hold that it has an nartik, so either you have to say the nartik is not a shell, which is not like a daifik. It's just an nartik doesn't mean a shell; it means a covering, so it has some sort of covering. Or I guess you could technically say it has some sort of shell, but it seems like it doesn't. Or you could say that this medrash is not talking about the Chilazon HaTecheiles, which seems to be the pashtus of the most Rishonim.
Okay, so that's really kind of that whole piece: Chilazon HaTecheiles, nartik, and again, I can just say it here now, and for everything, see the book much more in depth. Okay. Now, the next section of the book is Simonim. And we're not going to work through every chapter piece of piece, it's just kind of the overview here. But the Simonim, this is a big part where the Gemara mentions the 5 Simonim. And just, a kind of 30,000-foot view of what are the Simonim. And right away, I think when I had your book, I brought it to shul, and people say, well, the Simonim, wait a minute, it's Agarata. How could you quote the Simonim? And that's something you address right off the bat. So I think, tell everyone where the Gemara is, what the Gemara says Simonim are, and that taina that this is just agarata and not actual literal simanim of the Chilazon HaTecheiles.
Right. So again, we went through the history as the first step, just to show. So the Radziner Rebbe, when he wanted to find the Chilazon HaTecheiles, as we said, first place he goes is to Chazal to see what the simanim are. Now the issue with the trunculus, as we mentioned, is it doesn't match the simanim. Hopefully we'll be able to go through the simanim at least basically to show this. So if it doesn't match the simanim, there's really only one thing you can say. Now again, there's two things you can say, which is, one thing is you can say it's incorrect. The other thing you can say is that the simanim don't mean what they say, which is basically saying that they're agadata. As we mentioned, the sugya is starting from the conclusion. So I just wanted to finish up on the last point with in terms of the species. When you have that many Rishonim giving a description of a species of a creature, there's only one reason why you would possibly say something else. And that's if you see the creature and you say, this is the Chilazon, so then you are forced to say that when the Rambam said dog, he meant a snail, and when Rashi said telas, he meant a snail. But if you don't have a creature, anybody learning the sugya and seeing 20, 25 Rishonim all saying something which seems to be shaylo, a snail, nobody would say it's a snail. So here too, with the simanim, when you see the simanim don't match the mirics, you're left with one option, which is that it must be the simanim don't mean what they say. Now, all the Rishonim understood the simanim very, very simply. The simanim are very simple. Hopefully we'll be able to go through them. But when the creature that you have as the Chilazon doesn't match, So you have to say it's an agadata. Now they try to bring rayas that's an agadata. I'm not sure how in depth you want to go into the rayas and the answers to them. But hopefully we can suffice to say the Rambam brings them down la'alacha. The Maril says the only way you'd be able to refine the Chilazon, which he says is possible to do, is through using the Simanim. The Radziner Rebbe, when he went through it again, as we mentioned, used the Simanim. Reb Herzog, when he was checking out if the Murex was correct, was using the Simanim. And there's really only one reason why you would ever say these Simanim are not meant to be taken at face value, and that is if the creature that you're looking at does not match the Simanim at face value.
Going back to that theory, which we mentioned earlier, kind of the thesis, rather, that undergirds your whole book, which is that they first found the creature and then decided to stuff it into everything. So if it doesn't work, then you have to say it's agadata. And as you say in the book, and you just mentioned the Rambam quotes halacha, not agadata, and that this is the first time that you find that it's agadata. So I think you should mention, look, obviously we're not going to go through this in depth, look in the book. But I think just an overview, kind of, if you will, of what the simanim are and why they don't fit with the murex. And by the way, you're going through the whole sugya, but if it's not apparent, it should be now. The book is kind of attacking the murex, if you will, saying that the modern kind of usage of the murex is not correct. That's your theory that you're working with the whole book. But say, what's the overview of the simanim and kind of why you don't think the murex fits?
Yeah, okay, fine. So the first siman in the Brisa is Chilazon that gufay daimel yam, that its guf is daime to the yam. Its guf is comparable to the sea. Rashi says that maras gufay, the appearance of its body, is daimel yam. The Rambam, when he brings it down, he says the color of the Chilazon is the color of the yam, is the color of the sea. There's a Mishnah in Masechtas Tzitzis, or Brisa Masechtas Tzitzis, which instead of saying is daimel yam, it says that the guf. It says that the Chilazon is guf is daime l'rakia. It's daime to the sky. So now you might have a question. Okay, well, it sounds like a sphere. This one says daime l'yam. This one says daime l'rakia. So it's pashut, right? Tcheles is daime l'yam, which is daime l'rakia. The yam and the rakia are the same color. They're blue, the color of tcheles. So obviously there's no steer. It's saying that the color of the Chilazon is blue. There's a gears in the Rambam. This is interesting. There's a gears in the Rambam which says that the color of the Chilazon is tcheles, which makes sense because it's daim l'yam, daim l'rakia. Tcheles is daim l'yam, daim l'rakia. The Chilazon is daim l'yam, daim l'rakia. So the Rambam brings it down as daim l'rakia. Sorry, daim l'tcheles. That its color is tcheles. So now they point out that it's an incorrect gears in the Rambam because really he said daim l'yam. Fine. The Ma'aser Keach brings down this corrected gersa, but he says it doesn't matter. You don't have to fix it because who cares? Tcheles is the color of the yam and the color of the sky. This is how the Radziner Rebbe understood the siman. To my knowledge, there's not a single Rishon who understands it any other way. This is how Rav Herzog understood the siman, and this is how there's come out no other way to learn the siman. Pasha, at least it'll be the Rishonim, what it could possibly mean. But when you get to the murex, so the murex is not the correct color, which is why Rav Herzog said it's incorrect. It's not the correct color. It's not blue at all. The murex it's like a rocky color. So this is what they said, and this is why this again is why the history is very interesting. Like I mentioned, in the 1980s, it was before the yeshivish push. So they were the first people to try to answer the questions from Rav Herzog's PhD thesis, right? So they were the first people to try to answer it. Again, it was a completely secular Israeli scientist who saw this question from Herzog that the murex does not match the first siman of the Brisa because it's supposed to be a blue color and it's not. And what he says is, okay, but you see, when it's on the bottom of the sea, it gets covered in an algae. Algae is like this; it's like a greenish, like a mossy kind of color, which covers basically the whole seabed. If you have a fish tank, you're probably gonna get algae in your fish tank. It's like this, like greenish color. And it covers the murex, so they say, that's what it must have been. Now, this exact answer is taken on by the Tcheles Chabura, by any Tcheles Sefer that you see that's pushing for the murex. They'll say the first siman. In fact, in the Levush Aron, it lists this as a raya. This is one of the rayas that the murex is the Chilazon. One of the rayas the murex is the Chilazon is that it matches the first siman perfectly because it says daim l'yam and the murex tranquilus is mamish daim l'yam. Now, they don't just stop with saying it's algae. They actually give 4 different answers, and they say, you see, it doesn't just match one way, it matches the Brisa in 4 different ways. Because, first of all, it gets covered in algae, which is the color of the sea. Now, it's not. It's green, so it's not the color, but you could say that maybe the green is the color. It's not the color of Tcheles, and it's algae. It's covering. There's a lot of problems with that, but again, we're not going to go. I'm just giving the answers. I guess you can make your own decision whether it matches. The other answer is that the murex shell is bumpy. just like the waves of the sea are bumpy. So maybe that's what it means. The other answer is when it says daim l'yam, it means daim to the sea bed, not the sea. And the color is like a rock. It looks like the seabed. And then the other answer is it's the I think it's maybe the material of the seabed, something like that. So basically, they give a bunch of different ways to explain it, but none of them are based on the Rishonim, and none of the ways of the Pashas way. All of them are only ways you could possibly come up with if you've already accepted the murex is a Chilazon, because it does not match a simon. So the only possible way to match a simon is you have to say it's talking about the algae on it, or the bumpiness of the shell. So that's the first simon. The second simon we already discussed is Briasa Dem Ladug, but just going to touch on it again because it's very important. The way I was explaining the simon, and this is the way the Ritzinger Rebbe understood the simon, and this is Pashas the way the Rishonim are understanding the simon, is that Briasa Dem Ladug means that it's in the tzur of a dug. It swims around like a fish. It looks like a fish. It has fish-like characteristics, fish-like character traits. Taisus mentions that when you take it out of the water, it thrashes around, and it's makar misasai by thrashing around. So, but they have a snail. So a snail is not Briasa Dem Ladug, so it doesn't match a second simon. So what are you supposed to do to try to match up a snail with having the form of a fish? So they say that the shell of the murex is shaped like a fish. Now, again, you'll hear them say they asked their 7-year-old and he said instantly it looks like a fish. And then you'll hear other people say, me personally, I don't think it looks like a fish. My brother thinks it kind of does look like a fish. You can look at it. It doesn't really matter because it's all completely missing the point. The simon can't be talking about a shell being shaped like a fish, because if it is, then the Rambam and all the Rishonim who quote the Rambam's Lashon completely skip out this simon in the Brisa. The way I was explaining this simon in the Brisa is saying Briasa Dem Ladug, it's in the tzur of a dug. So the Rambam says, it's a dug. So that is the simon. It means it's in the tzur of a dug. So he's bringing down the simon. If you learn that when the Rambam said dug, he was lavdafka and he actually just meant a sea snail, so then he completely left out the simon. So this entire simon is completely left out by basically all of the Rishonim, and is understood in a way that can only be understood once you've already had the murex. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, the third simon is Eilach Hashem Shana. It rises once every 7 years. Again, there's a lot of discussion as to exactly when this happened. Is it still happening? Did it only happen Bisman Abayas? Where did it rise? Did it rise into the mountain? Did it rise to the top of the sea? Whatever it is, the murex doesn't do any of that and could never have done any of that, because the murex was an incredibly famous creature, and it would have been spoken about if it had been rising, and we know it doesn't rise. So what do they say to answer up the simon of it rising once every 7 years? They say 7 years doesn't mean 7 years. That's first. I don't know exactly where they get that. I understand that 70 years is sometimes used as like a once in a lifetime, but I don't know why it's muchaf over here that it's being used in that way. But let's pretend it is. So how is the murex rising once every 7 years? They say there's based on the wind patterns, is sometimes like this giant wave that washes ashore once every while. It washes ashore like all these different types of sea life and sea creatures and sea snails. And although we haven't seen it with the trunculus itself, it's possible it happens with the trunculus also. There's no reason why not. It washes up everything. So maybe that's what it means, which basically means they're saying the brisa, which is describing the Chilazon as rising once every 7 years, means once in a while all of sea life gets washed ashore, which doesn't make any sense as a simon for the Chilazon because that applies to everything. But that's how they understand that. The next simon of the brisa, and this one gets overlooked all the time, is that uvedamaid saivin tchelas, that you die tchelas using the blood, the dam of the Chilazon. With the murex, you don't use the dam of the murex. You use a mucus. It's very, very distinct from the blood. It has nothing. It's life force. It's not blood in any way. It functions the same way human mucus functions. In a human, that's the way this mucus functions in the murex. So, in order to answer this, they say maybe dam doesn't mean dam. If you look through the Rishonim, again, you can in the Sefer I bring down all the Makaris. It's mucha from kimat every discussion, halachic discussion lagabe Shabbos, that the blood of the Chilazon is the actual dam. The Rishonim are constantly asking questions like why isn't it Netilas Neshama by taking out some of the blood? Oh, how is it a psikresha? And they talk about cutting it from a limb where the blood is not going to kill it, or leaving in enough blood that it'll keep it alive. So what do? Taisus answers. One of the questions that's asked is why isn't it Netilas Neshama for taking out the dam of the Chilazon? Now, obviously, this question only makes sense if we're talking about blood. If we're not talking about blood, then there's no question, right? Nobody's asking. Like I mentioned this in the Sefer. Nobody asks, why aren't you chayav in Tilas Shama for blowing your nose on Shabbos because mucus comes out, right? So obviously, the question is telling it being blood. Now, Taisvis answers this question. He says, Mifkad Pakin. Maybe this blood is not the blood that circulates the body. It's a blood that's pooled together. This is an answer that's used in different places in Shas to explain why something wouldn't be in the Tilas Shama. It does not mean it's not blood. It just means the blood is pulled together. You have this by Dam Basulin, which is Mifkad Pakin, which is actual Dam. All it means is that the blood is pulled together. It's not flowing around. It does not mean it's not blood. Okay, fine. So what do they do? The Levush Aron brings this, again, as another raya to the Murex. He says, look, Taisa says the blood is Mifkad Pakin, and we see by the Murex also that the blood is Mifkad Pakin, is pulled together. It's not the blood, it's the mucus, and obviously it's pulled together because there's no other, the other fluids in the body are not circulating around. And Taisus would never have asked this question if we were talking about the mucus. Okay, but that's another ride the Levush Aron brings, and I think a misrepresentation of Taisus' answer. But you see from the Rishonim very clearly, and again, if you go through the Sefer, you'll see it more clearly, that the blood was actual blood, and this is also a siman. It's one of the simanim of the Brisa. Is v'dam etzav HaTecheiles. It's interesting that all other sea creatures that we die from, meaning all of these different snails and any other creature that you die from, you don't use the blood. You use a mucus, or you use an ink sac, or you use something else. You don't use the blood. Which means if this Brisa is coming to describe the Chilazon as unique, a uniqueness of the Chilazon is that you use its blood. Lafuke, all other creatures that you die from, where you don't use the blood, you use some other material in it. So that's the fourth sim in the Brisa. And the fifth one is Lefika Chtami Vikarim, that therefore, which Rashi and other Rishonim explain to mean, because it's only Oila Achas Shivim Shana, therefore it is very expensive. This again is brought as a raya to the Murex, because the Murex dye is very expensive. The Murex dye has been understood. The Murex dye is very expensive because each Murex has a minuscule amount of mucus in it, and you need thousands and thousands of them with tedious labor and disgusting, smelly labor in order to produce any amount of anything. Therefore, is very expensive. The Chilazon was expensive because it was rare. So the Murex is expensive because you need literally thousands of them to do anything with, and the Chilazon is expensive because it's rare. Those are opposite things. And yet, this is again listed as one of the proofs in the Levush Aron that the Murex is the Chilazon because it's expensive. So that's the fifth siman. Now, there's a sixth siman which is mentioned by the Rambam, which is that Damai Shachar Kidyai, that the blood of the Chilazon is black like ink. This obviously doesn't match with the Murex. The Murex mucus is not black at all; it's colorless. Even once it comes out of the Murex, it starts changing to different colors and never reaches black. Is not one of the colors that it comes to. So they say that if you look at the vein, it's like a very dark purple. If you look at the not the actual mucus is colorless, but if you look at the vein, it's like a dark purple. It's unclear what they're trying to say from that, because he doesn't say that the vein is dark purple. He says that the blood is black like ink, and black like ink is not dark purple, and the vein is not the blood. So it's unclear exactly what the answer is, but that's the answer. So those are the six simanim from the Brisa and the Rambam, and not a single one of them match the way the Rishonim understand it. Now, if you're working backwards, can you figure out a way to maybe fetch it in? I don't think so, but maybe. But it's definitely not through learning the sugya you come to these conclusions.
Where was the Chilazon found? I think this is well known about Zvulun, but everyone knows the Gemara about this. But this is another issue with Murex.
Yeah. So the Chilazon, it's a little bit complicated. It's a bit of it's a sugya like any other sugya. Pasha says the Chilazon was found in the chelik of Zvulun as a gift for Zvulun, so Zvulun can make a parnasa because he didn't get good land. There's a Gemara in Megillah where he complains about the land that he had, and Hashem says that it's going to be Geneva basically. It comes out from the sugya that it's going to be Geneva if any other shevet takes the Chilazon without permission of Zvulun, which means that the Chilazon is found in the chelik of Zvulun. There's also Gemara in Shabbos that says when Nebuchadnezzar was coming through, so he left behind when everybody was when he was forcing everybody out, he left behind certain people, which Chazal understand to one of the types of people he left behind were the Tzadei Chilazon, the trappers of the Chilazon, which he left behind from Sulamis to Tzordat Haifa, which is a small coastal area to the north of Eretz Yisrael. So Pashas, if you're leaving behind trappers of the Chilazon, so it kind of tells us two things about the Chilazon. First of all, that's where it's found. And second of all, it tells us that you needed some sort of expert trapping in order to get the chilazon. You couldn't just have anybody do it, so otherwise he wouldn't have had to leave behind these people in order to trap it. So Pasha says that's where it's found, and nowhere else. Now it could be it's machlekes rishonim. It could be found elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Also, the murex is not dafka found there. It's found everywhere. In other words, it's found throughout the entire Mediterranean, and it's even found in other seas outside the Mediterranean. Now, again, this is presented. The way they do this is they say, look, you see in this Gemara that they left behind trappers over here, and we found that there's a dye house. There are dye houses that are in this area by Tzor and Tyre. There's dye houses with the murex, which is an odd understanding of the Gemara, because the Gemara is saying where the chilazon itself was found. It's where you needed to trap the chilazon. It's not saying where you needed to dye, where there were dye houses of the chilazon. It's saying where the chilazon itself was trapped. In fact, the Gemara does discuss where the dye houses of the chilazon was, and the only place that's discussed in the Gemara where the dyeing was done was in a city called Luz, which we don't know exactly where it is. But that seems to be where the Tcheles was dyed, was in the city in Luz. So the murex is not found where the chilazon is supposed to be found, because the chilazon is supposed to be found dafk in one area, and the murex is found all over the place, including that area. So again, the way they'll present it is, look, it says it's supposed to be found here, and then we have dye houses right here. But the Pasha says it has to be found dafk in this location, and the murex is found in numerous locations all over the place, not dafk in this location.
So there's 4 chapters in the book. The next part is the chilazon, various halachic issues, and the chilazon in halacha. That's 70 plus pages. I'll leave that for the book. I think we, did enough Torah on the podcast. Not that we aren't doing that on the podcast, but it's not a full shiur. I think anyone interested in that should check out the book and read it. You alluded to some of it, especially as pertains to issues with the chilazon HaTecheiles being in the murex, so I'll leave that. But chapter 17, I think, is an important, very important point, which is, where did the chilazon go? And this is, I guess, let's discuss that. And what they say, and what your answer to that is, and then maybe we'll follow up with some questions on that.
Okay, so this will probably take us through the decrees.
Yes.
So the Sifri is probably the earliest mention of the chilazon's disappearance, and the Sifri says a story where Rabbi was walking, and he sees an old man, and he says, "Hey, what's your parnasa?" And he says, "Oh, I trapped the chilazon." And Rabbi says, "It's v'chli matzahu. Is it found? The chilazon's found?" And he says, "Yeah, there's a place in the Harim that's in the sea that's surrounded by mountains, and there's spiders surrounding it. And anybody goes there, the spider bites them, and they die right in their place." And Rabbi responds, "It's nikkerhu sheganas tzadikim lasad lava. It's very clear that it's been ganas for tzadikim lasad lava." Rabbi is in the 2nd century. So in the, between 100 and 200 in the period of the Tanaim. So we see already pretty soon following the Churban, it was already very, very difficult to find the chilazon. The Midrashim also state that the Tcheles is nignaz. That's in terms of how we lost the chilazon. The only lashonos brought down in our Messiah are ganaz l'tzadikim l'aslavai, nignaz, and that's it. So if you're coming from the Torah Makaris as to where it went, so it was hidden. Now it could be a question as exactly how it was hidden, because we see in the Gemara also that it was clear the Amoraim had access to Tcheles throughout the period of the Amoraim, at least limited access. Pashas, I think from the Sifri, you also see that they had limited access, because at least this one person was able to get it, even though it was ganas in a makom that's surrounded by poisonous spiders that kill anybody who goes near it. This guy was clearly able to do it. Pashas is that for the Tanaim and Amoraim who were on such a madrega, Hashem gave them the ability to acquire Tcheles, but Pashas of Chilazon for the Hamaynam was hidden away. This one person was able to get it, and maybe that's why they had it. So what does it mean the Chilazon was nignaz? Pashas, it means the Chilazon was a very rare creature. It came up once every 70 years. Maybe it stopped coming up, like the Rabbi says that it stopped coming up after the Churban. Pasha says it did stop coming up because we don't see anything coming up. Maybe we're missing where it's coming up, but I think Pasha says it stopped coming up. That could be part of the Geniza process, is that it stopped coming up. It's very rare. It's Hashem put in a place where it's incredibly difficult to get at. Anybody who would try to get it was getting killed. So Pashas, that's how we lost Tcheles, is because the Chilazon disappeared. That would be just from the Messiah in terms of what happened to it. That seems to be what happened. The issue is, and then the Gainim say we don't have it, and the Rishonim say we don't have it, and the Freinim say we don't have it, and all the way until the Rizin Rebbe we didn't have it. And the Rizin Rebbe also didn't have it, and he was going ahead to try to find it. The issue with the Murex in terms of this Nakuda is that the Murex was never hidden. I mean, maybe they forgot about it in the 13th century, maybe in the 15th century, about 800 years after the Chilazon disappeared. But the Murex never disappeared. The Murex was incredibly common, was incredibly accessible, was used an incredible amount, and so it becomes difficult to understand what it means gamma. So the basic explanation that's given is that there are these decrees against the Murex, and these decrees against using the Murex are what's going to explain why we don't have the Murex anymore, why we don't have why the Yidden forgot about the Chilazon. So the decrees are very simple. As we mentioned at the beginning, the Murex was historically known to make shades of purple, reddish purple, bluish purple. These Murex were incredibly famous and incredibly popular because they were used by the Roman elite, the Senate, and the Emperor to make their garments. The senators would wear like sashes dyed with this stuff. The emperors would wear full robes dyed with this. And beginning around right before the Churban by Sheni, the Roman emperors started making decrees against commoners wearing full robes of purple, of this reddish purple dye, which is what the emperor would wear. So you might be thinking, what does that have to do with Chelas? It doesn't have to do with Chelas, but it has to do with the Murex. These decrees went on and off for the next couple of hundred years. According to some historians, the decrees were completely off in the 2nd century, which is when Rabbi said, could it be found? Could the Chilazon be found? The decrees were completely gone, and that was actually the period where historians point out the most widespread use of the Murex dyes was during this one period. Then the decrees come back on. Again, sometimes they're decrees against full robes. Sometimes they're against specifically these two shades of royal purple, which is more of a reddish purple. At one point, they say the Tyrian dye shops, the dye shops in Tyre, were the shops that they would make the best quality purple. So at some point, they said those dye shops are now owned by the emperor, and he's going to be the only one being able to make this dye. Again, the decrees have nothing to do with blue. They have nothing to do with Chelas. They would not have to do with a string of Chelas, because most of them are against a full trimming or a full robe or a full sash or something like that. Maybe you have 50 to 100 years where there is actual problem with owning the dye, maybe. But Pashas, it wouldn't have been a blue dye, right? Again, the theory would be that the Murex is being used by the Yidden to make this blue dye, and the Goyim either don't know about it or don't care to make a blue out of it because they're making the purple. But these decrees have nothing to do with Chelas, and they wouldn't stop Chelas. But let's put all that aside, and let's pretend that the decrees actually would somehow stop the Yidden from using the Murex. Okay? What we're trying to figure out is not why did we have 100 years of history where Yidden were not able to wear Chelas. The question is, how did the entire Messiah lose track of the Chilazon to the point where they had no clue what the creature was? So the question is it possible to forget that the Murex is the Chilazon? So what do we know about the Murex? Well, we know the Murex was being used by the emperors. We know it was the most common dye source, or most expensive, most prestigious dye source in antiquity. We know that the decrees mention it, came out by name. So you'd have to imagine a kid, he's saying Shema, and he asks his tati, he says, I understand, we're saying in Shema, we're saying we're supposed to be wearing tchelas. Why aren't we wearing tchelas? And the father, so for the first years, the father says, well, you see, there's these decrees against the Murex, so we're not able to use the tchelas. And already 50 years later, they already forgot why they're not wearing tchelas in the first place. Because again, nobody mentions these decrees. Right? These decrees are not part of our Messiah. Our Messiah is that the Chilazon was gamas. So you have to somehow explain how the Yidden forgot completely that the Murex is the Chilazon. Again, not just why we have to stop wearing it for a little bit. So first problem is that the decrees don't mention anything about blue. Second problem is, even if they did mention something about blue, it wouldn't explain how we lost the creature, because the creature is easily re-identifiable. Right? It'd be super easy to re-identify it because the decrees mention it, the Roman emperors are wearing it, and I think perhaps most importantly, there's Kamat only 3 or 4 sea creatures that produce a dye in the first place. In other words, if the Chilazon is something we know about, then we have 4 options. So how do you ever lose one of your 4 options? Just go to the 4 options, look at the Brisa. Brisa describes it, and there it is. So the decrees don't mention anything about blue. That's one problem. Even if it mentions something about blue, it still wouldn't cause us to lose the creature. And even if it somehow causes us to lose the creature, you'd have to go ahead and explain how the item didn't refine the creature once the decrees went off. In other words, you only have 4 options, 3 options, 4 options. So why didn't they go ahead and refine it? Why weren't the Rishonim able to refine it? In my opinion, it's not possible for it to have been forgotten in the first place because the decrees don't mention anything about it. But I think you'd have to answer those 4 stages in order to get past this issue.
You spend a lot of time on the decrees, especially in the first part of the academia section. But I want to turn back. You mentioned there the Messiah thing, and you mentioned the Nignaz thing. So let's talk about those 2 things here, which is something important to discuss. And the number of the Askamas to your Sefer, which we'll get to in a bit. Who gave you Askamas? You have quite a bit, and they're actually really real, written out Haskamas. Some Haskamas are just like, oh, this guy came to me, great guy, here you go. Like, they actually wrote stuff. There's more Teichen in your Haskamas, but we'll get there shortly. So when you talk about Nignaz and Messiah, this is something that you mentioned a variety of sources. Yeshua's Malka. You mentioned the Aruch HaShulchan Chutz La'alacha was Nignaz. You mentioned then contemporary versions, Rosh Sternbach and Vad Yosef, Rav Kiva Yosef. You mentioned Menashe Klein. You mentioned Chaim Kanievsky, where they asked Chaim Das Noita, and he says, we have a Kabbalah, and they said, what it could be Nignaz. So let me ask you this. When we talk about Nignaz and Messiah, are those one and the same, that it was Goynez and therefore not a Messiah? Are those 2 different things? Because this is one thing, as I mentioned before, and I have friends that were like, no, now you have to push him. Like, where does the Messiah thing come from? Where is this that we have to have a Messiah and that we don't have Messiah? So what would your answer to that be?
So, yeah, I mean, honestly, it's probably Vade above my pay grade. This is something that the Gedolim would, and something that requires a Messiah or doesn't require a Messiah is definitely beyond my pay grade. It seems to be the Redziner Rebbe, that was exactly what the Redziner Rebbe was trying to convince the Gedolim of his time, was you don't need a Messiah. So you can read through the beginning of the Redziner Rebbe's Sefer and you'll get his arguments, which, by the way, if you hear the Murik's arguments where people are arguing you don't need a Messiah, Kamat, all of them are found in the Redziner Rebbe's Sefer. I don't know if they got it from him or they both came to independently. The Gedolim of his time did not agree with him, and the Gedolim of our time do not agree with that. So, and then in terms of is it the same question, Ganas and Messiah? Pashas, Pashas is not, but they're related. There's one thing that we have a Messiah that it was Ganas. So what does that do? So I don't know if we found a creature that matched mamish everything and was exactly it. Would I say, oh, but it's Ganas, so it can't be it? I don't know if I would say that. I don't know if the Gedolim would say that. But if we have a creature that has a lot of questions on it, and then you ask the question and they say, well, what do you think it is? So then you can say, I think it's Ganas, so I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, I think it will match everything. So for me, Ganas is more just saying that until you find something that matches everything, the alternative is a creature that does match everything. Because it's hidden, so we can't see it. So all we know is if this is what the Torah says it should look like, that's what it looks like. And therefore, anything you find, if it doesn't match that, is not going to be it. And you can't ask me, well, then where is it? Because it's Ganas. That's where the Ganas more comes in for me. In terms of whether you need a Messiah, so that's the base Levi says that for something like this, you need a Messiah. It seems like Rav Chaim's going in that direction. It seems like a lot of the Gedolim accepted that as the response to the Redziner, is that for something like this, you do need a Messiah. And if that's the case, then the whole argument ends from the beginning, which is why I think a lot of the Gedolim, even some of them who gave us Skamas in the Sefer, Batsum did not, I don't think they did a ton of research into, definitely not into the academic parts of it, but even into the whole thing, because we need a Messiah for it either way.
Right, so there's 2 different things, exactly, which is you have the one part, which is you're saying, the Murex isn't the Tcheles, it can't be Kasha, Simonim, etc., etc. That's like going through it. That's basically engaging with them on that level, right? Academia, Torah, etc. Then you have, as you're mentioning, all the ones that you quote on the Haskamas, which is irrelevant. Even if it was right, there's no Messiah. It's supposed to be Nignaz Til Moshiach. Irrelevant. Doesn't make a difference. You read the Aruch HaShulchan. In Aruch HaShulchan is Aruch Chaim Simin Tes if Yud Beis. He says V'dash. As that Shalom Sfuris many years she'echad is bor she'matzei she'matzah hachilazon v'asim enu tchilas v'himshich achrav ez hanoshim And someone said, which the Radziner found Chilas, and there are people that did what he said. Ach lo hayu lo shemei migdal hador miklal Yisrael v'nisbatla davar kiyav goyel atzedik meir ben amen. It was nisbatla. They didn't listen. The Gedolim said no, and that's it. It's over. There's nothing doing. See, he's actually, it's like interesting. Not saying he's almost Torah. He's saying like, I'm not sure what exactly how he's teaching it, but yeah, as we mentioned, the Reb Chaim Kanievsky, you have the others as well. Now, you mentioned the Haskama. I think I mentioned them, and then you were talking about who gave Haskama. So you have Haskama from Ruben Feinstein. You have Haskama from Rabbi Mirbiat. You have a long Haskama from Yisrael Reisman, and we should talk about him as a Rabbi Belsky piece over there. We're going to get there. I'm sure listeners are thinking that as well. Rabbi Shmuel first. You have Haskama from Rabbi Daniel Shekleiman, the Kavas Lech Daniel Neustadt, who Daniel Neustadt says very clearly in his Haskama. He says that Im Kain loy lanu b'dereseinu ela elu legalis haknizo l'shtamishba, and he says also, he talks very clearly about the Messiah, Reb Shraga Kalis. You have a Haskama of Rameir Simcha Bax, as you said, you're from Detroit. You have Reb Simcha Scheinberg, Rafael Ariel Buchwald. You have your Kail in Detroit. And there's, I think that's all of them. But just, as I mentioned, a lot of them are very clear that we don't have it. Now let's go back to Rabbi Reisman specifically, because it comes to Sooner Rabelski, and where does Rabelski come into this? And I'm sure this is something you've been asked a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of times one of the first questions that gets asked. So I can't answer for Rabelski, because I don't, as far as I know, he didn't write anything that clearly lays out how he holds it matches Chazal. To the best of my knowledge, he's very closely related to one of the people who wrote some of the Contrasim for the Murex, and I think they did a very, let's say nicely, I think they did a great job in presenting a certain case based on the way things were quoted. And I think unless you were willing to read through all of these incredibly boring academic papers and books yourself, and you just took their word for it, it is very convincing. And so yeah, in the Skama from Mr. Reisman, so he mentions that he said it was like a big. It was like confusing to everybody why Rabelski held of it but wasn't pushing anybody to wear it. And his best theory is that at the beginning he held it was very, very strong, that was correct, and then Sveika started arising and more started popping up, and he didn't want to drop it, but he stopped. He basically stopped talking about it. So if that's the case, that sounds about right. It's similar to anybody who approaches a sugya. If the first thing they get is a Lavash Aron, they're probably going to be pretty convinced, and if they start looking into it more, they may become less convinced. I know Reb Daniel Asher Kleiman. So when I was talking with him, and he mentioned that he was looking into himself, and he read through Lavash Aron, and he was very, very convinced, and he went to his Rabbi, Reb Shmuel, and he asked him. Like, this is pretty convincing. Like, should I, maybe I should start wearing? And he was told, like, did you go through the sugya yourself, like any other sugya? Did you open up all the makaris and did you read through it yourself? And he realized he hadn't. He had read through the Lavojarin. So he started going through it, and he became one of the most vocal critics of the Murex. And yeah, he wrote a very beautiful Haskama and also a beautiful tshuva at the back.
Yes, it's good you mentioned the tshuva. You mentioned, I'll quote the Rabbi Reisman says, "V'roi l'das shemerenu Rav Yisrael Belsky lo amar l'talmidav l'ilbush tcheles v'zu v'loi dibur mimenu k'fi shemati meharbe meham lo amar la'af echen mibanav l'ilbush tcheles." Didn't any of his children to wear it either. And as you mentioned there, I think you mentioned a good point. We mentioned Rabbi Kleiman going to Shmuel Kamenetsky, which was, did you learn the sugya? And I think you're safer as well, from the other end, if somebody wants to wear it and go through the sugya. The point is, go through the sugya. And I think Your Sefer does very well. It's written clearly. It's easy, quick read. It's a very enjoyable read. I read it over one Shabbos. It's very enjoyable to read, eventually for the listeners. And that, you have everything quoted in the Hebrew quote, and then you translate it. It was very nice. You have a Hebrew and then an English. So it was black quotes. It's exactly where the source is. One thing that I actually learned from academia is everything needs a source. And if you have a source, great. So you have your book. Someone can take a source. Everyone can learn the sugya through either learn the sugya properly, or through your book, they can get all the Rambam and go through it. And if they want to have I assume you won't disagree with this, and if they want to have a different conclusion, you have a different conclusion. But at least you can get all the Rambam properly, see where it is, and go through the sugya and see what's lemaisa, rather than just, as you're saying, reading something and just what have you.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the beginning from my background in the modern Orthodox Yeshiva and Eretz Yisrael with these kind of things. So one of the Sfarim that I got early, Torah Chazal and Science by Rabbi Mazman. So that was really a big inspiration. First of all, like Imamish saved me in yeshiva over there, and then it was a big part of the inspiration for this. And one of the things he does, which was so great, is so much of the things don't need to be argued out if you just see the whole makar. Once you see the whole makar, the whole thing loses the whole argument because you see the makar. So one of the things I really wanted to do in the Sefer is you don't have to rely on me for anything. I'm going to give you the makaris. My friend, the way my friend described it, he said, you're not bashing the murex, you're exposing the murex. Yeah, all I want to do is I want to lay everything out. I tried not to miss anything from any makar that they bring down in support. I try to bring down. Obviously, anything that's questionable, I try to bring down. But I really try to bring down the whole sugya before even discussing the murex, just so that people so that people aren't afraid of the sugya. People come in sometimes and they think I've spoken to Gedalim and I asked them like, and they said I don't want to get into it. It's too difficult. All the academia is too much to get into. As but it's a Chilazon. It's not an academic sugya. But it's been dragged into academia so much that people are afraid to touch it. So really, the hope with the Sefer is that it just opens it up and people aren't afraid of the academia, so they could approach the Torah in a proper way.
We touched on some of the 150 pages of the academia section, which was Chapter 18, Decrees Against the Murex, Forgotten History, that we touched on. Did the Murex ever produce a blue dye? Claims that the Murex produced a blue dye, textile findings, linguistic reference to the Murex, archaeological evidence, chemical evidence, rediscovering Argamon, the historical Tcheles, the Achrayim, and I'll leave off the last two chapters for a second because I do want to discuss those. Anything in the academia section you want to discuss here and mention specifically, or those are things really better left for the listener to read if they're interested?
I could just say briefly, I guess I'm not sure how much, probably a lot of the listeners don't, it's a big problem for me because I've been involved in Sugya for 5 years, so I forget that everybody else is not involved, and I speak sometimes shorthanded, much more shorthanded than in the Sefer. So just to understand something about, we mentioned this, that the murex was not historically known to make a blue. One of the big pushes that they have to make, and this is kind of ironic and pretty funny, because as I mentioned, the academics have the murex as vadai the Chilazon. That's not even by the academic, in the academic world, it's not even a question. It's 100% vadai the murex is the Chilazon. But they have the Chilazon, for the most part, they have the Chilazon as making a blue purple, because that's what the murex makes. That's not acceptable in the yeshivish world. Any Ben Torah is not going to accept that the Chilazon made a blue purple. It has to make a blue. So the people who are pro-murex are stuck in this very, very awkward situation with the academics, because they are arguing with the consensus of academia on the academic side of things. In other words, they're claiming, I agree with you, academics, that the murex is the Chilazon, but it actually makes a blue, not a blue-purple. And a lot of the academics are very, very upset. And I quote at the beginning of one of the chapters, one of the email exchanges I had with one of the top textile experts in Eretz Yisrael, who holds the murex as vada the Chilazon, but he holds made of blue-purple. And you can see at the beginning of chapter 22, he says, OMG, 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 I saw them with my own eyes, I analyzed. He says, is there no end to the disinformation that's out there? They're very upset about the way it's being presented by the yeshivish community. So in order to kind of rework history and make it as if the murex made a blue, so they have to come up with all these different proofs that it made a blue. But the Matthias says it didn't make a blue. It doesn't make a blue, and it didn't make a blue, and possibly it never did make a blue. So most of the chapters are just responding to their attempted rayas, keneged, the academic conclusion that the murex didn't make a blue. Now, again, this is why are they convinced the murex must have made a blue? Because they hold the murex as a Chilazon, therefore must have made a blue. But it shouldn't come as a surprise. A lot of the Sfarim before this one would list all their rayas and then give answers like, but b'daiflik, you could say this or you could say this. I think one of the things I try to do in the Sefer is show that I'm not being daiflik your rayas. You're being daiflik the whole sugya to say that it made a blue. The Pasha says it didn't make a blue. The Pasha says it doesn't make a blue, and you could turn it into a blue. So that a lot of the chapters are really just focusing on the rayas that they try to bring that it did make a blue, which is connected the academic conclusion itself.
What about I told you I would ask you this before, that my neighbor who borrowed the book from me read, he wanted me to ask you, is that the claim that only the Jews use tcheles, but the Gemara discusses buying tcheles from non-Jews and so on.
Yeah, so I don't think I make the claim that only the Jews use tcheles. I think I said it was primarily used by the Jews. I think that Gemara, bring down the Mafsah Shekel, explains the Gemara that way. I think the Pasha says, I think the pashtus is that the Jews were primarily the users of the tchelis. It's clear in the Gemara that the Goyim used. I'm saying, as I mentioned before, in Vuzradra, and left behind trappers of the Chilazon in order to make garments for the king. So it's definitely possible that the Goyim were in it. There are Gemaras that are mashma that it's possible that the Goyim were using it, at least, or it's possible that they were using it. But it seems to be that the overwhelming majority of its use was the Yidden using it.
Chapter 29. And I'll just read the name of the chapter, and I think based on that you can answer the question. Why not just wear it?
Yeah, so I always found it to be an interesting question. It was hard to lay this out in the book, so and I doubt I'm going to do a better job in the podcast. But the question why not just wear is a very weird question if it's incorrect. In other words, if you go through the sugi and you see that there's a 99% chance it's not correct, so then why would you wear it? There's no concept of why not just wear it. The why not just wear it means if there's a tzad it's correct, so then maybe we should wear on that side. So when people ask me this question, the first thing I say is, even if I can't answer the question properly for you, we should accept that in the 1880s this question was asked. And the Rebbe Rabbi posited a creature that was at least a suffix. And the Gedolim and Klal Yisrael did not accept it. And they did not say, why not just wear it, let's just wear it. So we see that that's incorrect. That's first step. First step is it's incorrect. Okay, so now why is it incorrect? So the Gedolim give a bunch of different reasons why it's incorrect. They say it could be nefsekira. It could be that the whole tzad that it's correct because it comes so much from academia. It could be it's giving a tzad to academia, that academia is there's a strength to academia. There's really a halachic issue with wearing, and this is I think the most important. This is the most important piece that people really don't know, is that there's a strong tzad in the Rishonim. The strings of your tzitzis have to be the same color as the beged of your tzitzis. The beged and the strings have to be the same color. So again, I'm not going to get so much into the back and forth of it. But lefi those Rishonim, there's going to be a big issue if you're wearing blue strings that are not tchelas. So it could be that you're not makayim the mitzvah. Lefi those Rishonim. So that's a big part of the issue. Again, you can see all the reasons, but it's not. Unless I go like super into it, you could get out of each of these issues. You can explain why it's not. Maybe there's the issue of Baal Taisef. Some of the friends bring up maybe it's Baal Taisef, maybe it's Baal Tigra. You can explain why it's not everything. But again, these are all just explanations why we don't just wear it. The fact that we don't just wear it and the psak that we don't just wear it is already a 150-year-old psak that was given by the Rizina.
And as you mentioned, you also hammer home the Reb Chaim Kanievsky point that it was asked multiple times, and a lot of it's in Das Noite, which is a reputable sefer from the questions, and he said it again and again, it's not tcheles, it's not tcheles, it's not tcheles, don't wear it.
Yeah, and this is kind of funny because with Reb Chaim specifically, it's very crazy because they went hundreds of times to him to try to convince him, and obviously he wasn't even close to convinced. But they do a very interesting tactic, and again, this tactic it's kedai to talk about this tactic that they do. They'll say Reb Chaim says that if you look into it and you become convinced that it is correct, then you're mechuyev to wear it. But Reb Chaim didn't look into it himself, but he agrees that if you look into it, then you're chayav to wear it. So what does that mean? So they show this. There's this video. So somebody comes to Reb Chaim and he starts explaining how it's really not nignaz, and Reb Chaim he seems like he's like done with the conversation, and then he kind of just looks down at his sefer, and there's 5 seconds of silence, and then he looks up and he goes, "Zaygazunt, you're mechuyev." So the person, the guy comes over and says "Oh, you should know he's been dealing with this for many years." And Chaim says, "Atzlacha, you should be mechamet to be mighty me with your lima." So they take from there. They say, "Oh, you see, Reb Chaim said that if this guy is convinced that he's correct, then he's mechuyev to wear it." So you see, Reb Chaim saying that if you look into it, and avad it's good. He says you should be mechamet to be mighty me. So it's good to be to look into it. And if you look into it and you come out that it's correct, then you're mechuyev to wear. So Reb Chaim's basically even as a skama that you should look into it, and if it comes out as correct, it's correct. Reb Chaim's clearly saying it's not correct, and if you look into it and come out that it's correct, you're wrong. But about it, you're mechuyev to wear it. How could you not be? If you hold your chayiv in a mitzvah deraisa, so how could you not be chayiv? But he says you're wrong over and over again, and they mamish leave that part out and present Reb Chaim as if Reb Chaim didn't look into it, but you should look into it, and if you look into it, then Reb Chaim holds your mechayiv. And they do this to a lot of the different gedolim. They try to present it in such a way that he didn't come out against it when it's clear to any ben Torah that the gedolim were against this.
Who is the book meant for?
So it's meant for anybody who's interested in the topic. The reason I wrote it was mostly for the yeshivish world. In other words, the people I wanted to impact the most are the yeshivish world, the people who are Mashrav Torah, because it's really Kemat the only area that I can think of where this approach to Torah of academia over Torah and of completely twisting Makairos in order to match an academic conclusion to Torah, generally it gets sniffed out immediately and thrown out without getting involved in the nitty gritty. And that's how it was with the HaTecheiles also for a while. For a long time, it didn't get involved in the nitty gritty. It was sniffed out and said, this is incorrect. Especially recently, it's mamish made, it's gotten into the yeshivish community. You ask your average person, they have, they have this video that they show, and Rabbeim show it to I know there's like a 5th grade Rabbi in town who showed it to his class, and different Rabbeim when they get up to Parsha Shlach or whatever, they'll show this video, and the video is put out by these HaTecheiles people, and it's very, very, very krum. It mamish misrepresents Makaris like left and right. It misrepresents the Gedolim, and it presents it as if it's like, as if they're being open and fair and presenting both sides, but they're mom. If you watch the video, you'd really have to be a little bit silly to not agree with what's clearly their conclusion that the Mirix is correct. They basically present as if the Mirix is vada correct now, but there might still be reason not to wear it. And then they'll quote Rav Moshe Heineman saying there's an issue with Tzad, and they'll quote this guy saying there's an issue with this, and there's like, these 5 issues, but here's and here's what they would argue. But from a reality standpoint, so to speak, it's vada correct. And this gets shown to kids by Rabbeim who are, I'm sure well-meaning, but they didn't go through the sugya. And it's very difficult to go through the sugya. So that really the Sefer, I just want to open it up again. I want to open up the sugya, allow people to not be afraid of going through it, to look through it, because I really, really think it's one of the easier sugyas in the world to go through. I'm not big Talmid Chacham. It's a really, really not a hard sugya to go through. There's not a lot of makaris that you need to go through. It's bad. There's a few Gemaras, there's a few Rishonim. If you go through that, it's already enough. And if you're nervous about the academic proofs they have, so then you can rely on the Sefer. You could go through the Sefer if you're concerned about that. But the actual sugya, it should really be a very pashut sugya that everybody should be able to open up and go through.
I want to say the cover design is quite striking. It's got a bunch of different shades of blue, and then you have tzitzis going through the entire cover, all white tzitzis. So I think it was a good job, whether it was you or Ali Zayas, whoever's idea that was.
Ali Zayas designed the cover. They originally did put in one string of HaTecheiles, which I had taken out, but they did a really, really beautiful job. The cover is like, the first thing, it's funny, the things people mention to me when they first get the Sefer is how beautiful the cover is, and then the Askamas. So I said for my next edition, I might just have the cover, back cover, and the Askamas sandwiched between, and that's used to be the biggest hit of the whole thing. They really, really did a really amazing job. They're a pleasure to work with, and they're a great company in general.
So I'll link to the book in the show notes for those interested can purchase it. As I said, I thought it was an easy read, an enjoyable read. Now, I will say, I'm sure that I will get hate mail and comments, and you will also maybe fan mail as well. But for those interested, how can they reach out to you to send you hate mail or fan mail?
So at the beginning of the Sefer, I made a new email account just for this. I didn't want it to get mixed up with mine. It's Shut HaChilazon, so it's SHUT HACHILAZON, Shut HaChilazon at Gmail. Baruch Hashem, I've gotten a few emails, very positive. I have to say I'm surprised that there hasn't been so many criticisms of it, which is very, very surprising. But I imagine it should be coming, because it's definitely a controversial topic. So it's surprising. But
what I heard, this is not confirmed, I heard from those that know that it's selling well and that people are reading it and people are very interested in it. And like I said, it is an enjoyable read because I find it's interesting. Not only I think you did a good job making it easy and you have the full Hebrew quotes with the translation, it's nice because it's got that blend of Torah versus contemporary, halachic issue versus history, academia. There's a blend of a lot of different things in here. So it's a very enjoyable read. So we're coming up on Yom Tov season. People are always looking for things to read. It's a pretty good thing to read if someone's looking for something to read, whether by davening or whatever. I'm not telling my people to read things, but it's a pretty enjoyable read. So I'll link to that in the show notes. And thank you, Mati, for joining me to discuss Chilazon HaTecheiles and the HaTecheiles.
Thank you so much.